welcome back to the History of Christianity. I hope everyone is doing well today. Last time we looked at the 30 Years' War and the impact that had on the continent. And today we are going to go back over to England, and we're going to be looking at the Puritan movement in England, as the Puritans were a group of believers that believed the Church of England was still too Catholic, and they wanted to purify the church. That's why they of England. So that's why they're called the Puritans. And then we'll also finish up with a short piece on Reformed Orthodoxy. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're going to have our PowerPoint portion of this video on Puritanism and Reformed Orthodoxy. I'm not sure why that says rationalism on there. I'm sorry about that. Rationalism is the next lecture. It's Puritanism and Reformed Orthodoxy. Most of this video will be about the story of the Puritans, and then the very end will be about the Reformed Orthodoxy. So just some background for the Puritans. In England under Elizabeth I, so remember she was the queen after Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, so Elizabeth I takes over and has a long reign. Under her, there was a precarious religious tolerance. The nation of England was the Protestant Church of England, and the Catholics could practice, but they could not make any ripples. If they did, they were persecuted, they would be killed. But they could practice their faith, and they kind of had this idea of a separation of church and state where they would be obedient to the Pope as long as nothing really interferes with the Queen, but they would definitely obey the Queen as long as it didn't really interfere with their Catholic beliefs. So it was a very precarious kind of situation for the Catholics. The Calvinists in England, so that's Protestant, the Calvinists in England, they saw problems and tensions began, the problems within the Church of England. And they believed that your entire life and the structure of the church should be according to the Bible. Okay, so not of tradition and not from what the Queen would say or the King would say, but from the Bible. So we begin here with James I. Now he's the king. He's James Stewart. He's the king after Elizabeth I. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, she had no heir. She was not married. She's called the Virgin Queen because she was not married and had no heir. So she had declared that James I, he was also James VI of Scotland, that he would be king. And there he is on the right with his I'm not sure what he's wearing there, his tights and his pantaloons or something. He's over there wearing that outfit. He is the king of England, and this begins the House of Stuart. So the House of Tudor is gone, now it's the House of Stuart. And although Protestant, he had many conflicts with English Protestants that did not think that the English Reformation went far enough. And they thought that it was time to act. Now's the time to act, to continue on with this English Reformation to get it back to the New Testament church. So we have the Puritans. They got their name, Puritans, because they wanted to purify the Church of England back to how the Bible said it should be, the New Testament church. And so they really opposed many traditional Catholic, quote-unquote, Catholic-style elements of the Church of England. They objected to the use of the cross in worship. They objected to luxurious priestly garments because the priests in the Anglican or the Church of England, which is also called the Anglican Church, those priests they would wear luxurious robes and all kinds of ornaments to kind of stand out. They objected to communion at an altar. They thought that was too Catholic. You shouldn't have communion up there in the front at an altar. They objected to, not objected. They wanted Christian sober living, so living a disciplined life, a sober life, obviously not being drunk, but just a disciplined life. They wanted to keep the Lord's Day for worship and rest. They rejected the Book of Common Prayer. So remember that PowerPoint. The other PowerPoint where I had the three items highlighted in red, that because the Common Prayer had changed. Well, they rejected the Book of Common Prayer flat out, and also they rejected the use of written prayers. They were critical of drunkenness, and they rejected any immorality, and that's going to be important here in a second. Rejected any immorality and any activity that promoted immorality. In this case, such as the theater. A lot of the plays during that time would have debauchery in them and immorality being shown. So the Puritans began to fear that Rome was coming back. It was the Church of England looked too much like the Catholic Church. Okay, so they also had ideas about ruling in the church. So the Puritans did have a disagreement of how the New Testament church should be ruled, because there were two thoughts on it. There was the presbyter rule or elder rule, where you have presbyters or elders controlling the churches, or there was the independent way of ruling, where there's no presbytery, and that they should not rule, but each body of believers, each church is independent to be able to have its own way of governing itself. And this actually leads to the Baptists. Most of the congregations that became Baptists, they were from the independent churches. Beginning with John Smith, there's a picture of him on the right, 1554 to 1612. He was an early Baptist leader, and at first he was an Anglican priest who left the Church of England and started an independent church, which that was actually illegal to do. But he did it anyway. So because he was in trouble, his church fled to Amsterdam. He preached in the original languages. He said that every preacher should know the original language and preach from the original language, and he actually translated from the original language while he was preaching. So he definitely knew the original. He was a pacifist, no oaths, rejected infant baptism, and baptized himself with a bucket, and then went and baptized others. And so he's actually become known as the self-baptizer, because he basically took a ladle and poured it over his head from a bucket. Some of the Baptists returned to England under Baptist Thomas Helwys, and when they went back, the Baptist churches that were in England, they divided into a couple groups here. The General Baptists, which they had Arminian beliefs, which we'll talk about Arminianism in a little bit. But the second one was the Particular Baptist, and they held to Calvinistic beliefs. So the Baptists even split based on their beliefs. Okay, so that's just a little interlude. We're going to jump back here now to James I. The Puritans did not trust this king at all for a couple of reasons. Number one, he believed in absolute monarchy, that the king should be at the top and be able to do whatever he wants. And so he had a strong belief in totalitarian rule. So they did not like that he was an absolute monarchy, because if you think back to other absolute monarchies, such as Henry VIII, who's in charge of the church, and what he wanted to do, and also even like Mary Tudor, she ran the show like an absolute monarch. So the Puritans did not like that he was an advocate for absolute monarchy. Number two, James I was a homosexual. So this is an immorality situation for the Puritans there. They had a big problem with the King James I's way of living. He put his lovers in places of power and just had no conviction of his sin. Again, I have to point out, this is the head of the Church of England, head of the Protestant church in England, and he's living this lifestyle. So no conviction over his sin. Regarding his relationship with George, Duke of Buckingham, which, by the way, James I made him the Duke, James made this statement, and this is basically a blasphemous statement that James said. He said it publicly. He said it to his court and said it publicly in regards to his relationship with George, Duke of Buckingham. I, James, am neither a god nor an angel, but a man like any other. Therefore, I act like a man and confess to loving those dear to me more than any other men. You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak in my own behalf, and not to have it thought to be a defect, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had John, and I have George. So that's a statement from James the First, and the ending here is just it's blasphemous, because it's basically saying that Jesus Christ had a love for, in this case, John, the Apostle John, the one that Christ loved the most, as the Bible says. But Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. So because he accuses Christ of having this relationship, then he should not be blamed for a relationship he has with George. Christ had John, so alluding to a homosexual relationship here with Christ and the Apostle John. So I, meaning James I, have George. So that's the relationship there. Well, the reason I bring this out is this is this is the head of the Church of England, but again, James I, he's going to be the one that authorized the King James Version of the Bible, and he is living, and it's known in history, it's in history books. James I had many other men in his life in a immoral way. So for him to just get up there and blaspheme Jesus Christ and allude that Christ had a relationship with John as James had with George is complete blasphemy. So the Puritans had a major problem with his immoral living. Third is divine origin, the idea of divine origin. In 1604, Richard Bancroft, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, instituted the divine origin of the episcopal hierarchy with the king at the top. And so within the Anglican Church, there's going to be a structure, a power structure, all the way up to the king who's at the top. And this is, but what they said was divine origin. So God set the Anglican Church up. It's really resembling the Roman Catholic Church. So the Puritans said it was a step towards Catholicism, and so what they do is they appeal this action in the House of Commons, which is the lower house of the Parliament. The upper house is the House of Lords, but they appeal to the House of Commons because there are more Puritans in the House of Commons. The House of Lords is going to be full of nobility, which are going to support the king. So what happens is they hold this conference called the Hampton Court Conference, and it's called by James I to deal with the Puritans' objection. Now, no solution was reached in this Hampton Courts Conference, since the bishops of the church, they're supporting the king, of England. They're supporting him, that he's the head of the church. So the bishops are supporting him, and the House of Lords, they're supporting him. So nothing really comes out of this conference, except the only result is that a new translation of the Bible would be produced by King James's decree, which is the King James Version of the Bible of 1611. And this was to combat the Puritan Geneva Bible, because the Puritan Geneva Bible, it was the Bible script. The script was the Bible, but then they put in almost like commentary in the Bible of Puritan doctrine. And so King James didn't like that, so he had the King James Version of the Bible produced, that it would be given to the churches. He was viewed as a coward at the start of the 30 Years' War, because he did not want to support Protestant Frederick, but when he needed taxes raised, it was only passed with the condition that they would go help the Protestants in the 30 Years' War on the continent. So he wanted taxes raised. Well, the House of Commons was going to gridlock that unless he sent help to the Protestants in Europe during the 30 Years' War. Okay, so we come to the end of James I. He dies, and his son Charles I becomes king. And we see him there on the right, 1600 to 1649. He married Henrietta, the sister of French and Catholic King Louis XIII. So Henrietta is Catholic, and now we have the head of the Church of England marrying a Catholic. So the Puritans, they saw this as a clear danger and actually a step of apostasy. And they compared Henrietta to Jezebel of the Bible. Well, after an issue in Parliament, Charles I dissolved the Parliament, which contained Puritans in it, and he establishes a new one. Well, this continues on, and it happens 2 more times, and the Parliament is dissolved. Well, after dissolving the Third Parliament, Charles I rules for 11 years with no governmental body. There was no Parliament in England for 11 years. and he's basically just ruling now as absolute monarch. Well, the people they're getting upset at the king, and they're getting upset at the Church of England, their clergy, because the king is living in luxury, the clergy are living in luxury, the people are getting upset about what's going on, and they're struggling. And so the Puritans declare this as the age of New Jezebel, and uh, the monarchy is really corrupt. So in 1633, William Laud, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, he loved the pomp of the Church of England, and he cracked down on the Puritans because they couldn't stand the pomp of the Church of England. And what I mean by pomp is the processions, the notoriety, the wearing of the clothes, and this big show that's going on when they hold a church service. Again, almost like Catholicism. And so the Puritans were against this. So he cracks down on them, and there's arrests and mutilations and deaths of the Puritans. Well, with the help of some Scottish reformers from Scotland, riots ensued. And so Charles I, he didn't have a large enough army to deal with the riots. So what he did was he turned to Catholic Ireland for help. So the reformers and the Puritans, the reformers, the Scottish reformers, they're all coming together and they're causing a tumult. And Charles I wants to fight them, but he can't bring an army together, so he turns to the Catholic Irish. This brought Scottish Calvinists and English Puritans together. They linked together that they're going to have their side drawn against Charles I and his Catholic Irish army. In 1640, Charles I calls on Parliament to contain the issue, but it is dissolved almost immediately. That's called the Short Parliament. Now, the reason it's called the Short Parliament is just to give the name for the second one. The Scots invaded anyway, and Charles I was forced to call another parliament, and it's called the Long Parliament because it's going to last longer. The Long Parliament. And this is to get money for an army to face the Scots. Okay, so the Long Parliament. We got to look at what this is made of. It's made of the House of Commons, which is the lower house, and that holds many Puritans. So they're against Charles I and the Catholics. Then there's the House of Lords, which is the upper house. Now, in the House of Lords, you're going to have more people supporting the king because they're nobles and they're bourgeoisie, which many of them actually joined the mercantile class in economic investment. So they're kind of tied to the lower classes because they're investing their money in the merchants' business and trade so that they can get more wealth. Well, they're kind of tied with that. So because they're tied with that, they truly do not support the king. So the House of Commons doesn't support the king, and the House of Lords, because they're tied to the lower class mercantiles, they also don't really support the king. And so, as you see here down here on the third bullet point where my arrow is wiggling, upper and lower house join together and they limit Charles I's power. And in 1641, they create a law that the king could not dissolve Parliament anymore. So the king can't dissolve them and call a new one. What Parliament is there and has been voted in, that is going to be the Parliament, whether the king likes it or not. So right after this, we have a treasonous plot is uncovered. Parliament discovers that the king was secretly dealing with the Scots to undo the Long Parliament. And what happens is there's this kind of several different angles going on of treason. So that's treasonous what he's doing. Then Queen Henrietta also instigated a Catholic rebellion in Ireland to force the Parliament to give the funds to the king to raise an army. Because if the Catholics are rebelling, then we got to get an army there, so they need money. It will force them to give the money. Well, the lower House of Commons began pressuring the upper House of Lords to bring the Queen to trial. Well, Charles I wants them arrested for doing this, for wanting the Queen brought to trial. He wants them arrested. And they had, the people that he wants arrested have the support of the people. So Charles I has lost control of the people in London. He's lost London. And so Charles I withdrew to his palace in Hampton Court. So that's right here in Hampton Court. And this is his wife, Henrietta, a painting of her. The Anglican bishops who were members of the upper house of Lords were excluded from most of these parliamentary procedures. Anything to do with the bringing the charges and all of that, they were left out of it. And so they raised a militia. Charles I acted and raised his own army to battle the Parliament's forces. So we have sides drawn up with the military. So that's going to lead to this catastrophic event called the English Civil War. 1642 to 1651, the forces are going to go against each other, and again, this is tied in with the religion, with the Christianity, because you're going to have Catholics and you're going to have Protestants. The Catholics from Ireland, and you have Henrietta, who's Catholic, married to the king, and his forces aren't Catholic, but they're definitely supporting the king, against the Parliament's forces, which are going to be Puritans and Reformers. So, as you see there on the screen, the king's forces, they're called Cavaliers. They're made of nobility, and they definitely have a strong cavalry, which means horses, and they sought support from Catholic Ireland. The Parliament's forces, they're called the Roundheads. They were of the lower classes. They had a large infantry, so ground soldiers, and they sought support from Scotland, which are Protestant. They're Calvinists. So Parliament assembled Puritan theologians to woo the Presbyterian Scots to join them. So we even get theologians involved here to try to get them to join their side for the Roundheads. In 1644, Parliament executed the Anglican Bishop of Canterbury, William Laud, who was a big supporter of Charles I. They execute him for treason. Here's just two pictures, artistic impression there of a Roundhead on the left and a Cavalier on the right. The Roundhead would be like a Puritan. The Cavalier will be the king's forces. Another picture here of just a painting of the English Civil War, slaughtering on the field, you can see the cavalry charging each other. Okay, so during the English Civil War, we have the rise of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell, there on the right hand of your screen, he's a Puritan. He loved the scriptures. He was a member of the House of Commons, and he ends up raising a small cavalry, and because of his popularity, many joined him, and this cavalry becomes a mighty force, and alongside this large infantry. So they're doing pretty well. And it's said that when they went into battle, that they would be singing psalms. So the Puritans have a pretty good army. Well, the Parliament and Cromwell, the Parliament is basically controlled by the Puritans now, and Cromwell, they crushed Charles I's forces at the Battle of Naseby. Charles I, he goes and does this. He opens up negotiations with the Scots, with Parliament, and with the Puritan army. And he begins throwing all kinds of promises around that he's not going to be able to keep. So some Scots actually did join Charles I, but they were soundly defeated by the Parliament's army. And Charles I is arrested, and he escapes, and he's arrested again and all that. But he's arrested, and he's tried for treason. And on January 30th, 1649, Charles I is beheaded, and Henrietta fled to Paris and would return to England after the restoration of the monarchy. But again, just to point out here, this is England. This is a major player nation in Europe, powerful nation, and their king is beheaded. So, I mean, it's just, and then not just beheaded, but then the monarchy is dissolved. So a major shift takes place at the end of the English Civil War. So here's a picture of Charles I being beheaded, where the guy's about to bring the axe down on his neck. Okay, so this enters into the time period called the Protectorate or the Interregnum, but this is where the monarchy in England is abolished, Charles II, who was Charles I's son, he ends up fleeing to Europe. So he was actually supposed to be next in line for the throne, but he flees to Europe. And Oliver Cromwell takes over the country with Parliament's support. And he becomes known as Lord Protector, which is not a king, and they offered him to be king, but he refused it. But he's called Lord Protector. It's during this time called the Interregnum, which means between reigns, so between the reigns of the monarchy, because Charles I is dead, and then after the time of the Protectorate, it's called the Restoration. That's when Charles II does come back to be the king. So this time period here is between the reigns of Charles I and Charles II. His parliament would include English, Scottish, and Irish, so you can just imagine all the religious sidings there. It reformed the state and the church during this time period. There were independents, there were Presbyterians and Baptists that all grew. Even Anglicans grew. A lot of these different groups began to grow. Advocated for a strict Puritan lifestyle. Again, Cromwell is a Puritan, and he's running the show now, and so he is advocating for a strict Puritan lifestyle. He banned excessive living, theater, gambling, anything to do with secular Christmas or secular Easter. Men had to walk around with black, wearing black clothes, and they had to wear their hair short and cropped, so it was a haircut. When Cromwell died, his son Richard took over but was weak, and he resigned the position soon after, so the protectorate failed. And this brings in the time of the Restoration. When the protectorate failed, Parliament had no choice but to establish the monarchy again, and they call Charles II back to the throne, or back to England to be on the throne. Now, Charles II, he's known as the Merry Monarch. He rebelled against any Puritan values, so complete opposite of Cromwell. He loved parties, he loved women, he was very hedonistic. His whole court was hedonistic, which means they loved pleasure and debauchery. He never produced a legitimate heir, but he did have 12 illegitimate children. So just a complete disaster in regards to the moral living there. But he was called the Merry Monarch. Well, many feared Charles II's brother, who was James VII, or James II of England, James VII of Scotland. He was the Duke of York at the time. Now, he is Catholic. Okay, so James VII or II is Catholic. And many feared that Charles II's brother, who was Catholic, that he would come and rule after Charles II's death. But in response to the public fears, Charles II has his niece, Mary II. Now, her dad was James VII or II. So this is her dad right here, the guy they're scared of. His daughter marries, Charles II sets up that Mary, the daughter of James VII, marries William III of Orange, who is Dutch and Dutch Protestant. So he's not even English, he's Dutch, and he's not Catholic, he's Protestant. Okay, so Mary's dad is Catholic, Mary marries a Protestant. However, it doesn't happen in time. Charles II dies, and James VII becomes the king anyway. Okay, so he's brother of Charles II, and he's Roman Catholic. So this is not good for England. Everything they're scared of is about to come true. But we have the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Okay, now this revolution, we're not going to go into great detail of it, but it was a bloodless coup by Mary II and her husband, William III of Orange, and her dad flees. So James II, he flees because, think about Charles I, got his head cut off, so her dad takes off. And that leaves William and Mary as joint monarchs. Okay, so you see their reigns there. Mary reigns from 1689 to 1694, and then William reigns from 1689 with his wife, but then when she's gone, dies in 1694, he continues on until 1702. This is, again, during the time of the English are now moving over into the New World, into America, establishing the colonies, and William and Mary College is established and is named after them, which still exists today. Okay, so the result of the coup. No more absolute monarchy. It established a constitutional monarchy, which exists today in England, still today. It's how it was set up then after the Glorious Revolution, and with Parliament having a Bill of Rights. Number 2, established a constitutional monarchy. Oh, I just repeated that. I'm sorry. Let me bring up that pen again, like I did last time. Pen color. I said that twice. Number 3, ensured Protestants' faith in England. So Church of England and the Puritans, they're able to basically worship how they want and live how they want. And then 4, Battle of Boyne, James VII or II allied himself with the French and took an army to Ireland as a staging place for the invasion of England to take back the throne. Well, William III invaded Ireland first with a massive English army, and he's victorious. So just a couple of results of the coup. No more absolute monarchy. Ensured the Protestants were able to have their faith in England. And then the William III is actually victorious over James II and his little idea with an army. Okay, so that's it for our time that we're going to look at the English Civil War and the Puritans. Again, that's kind of like a big story that I told you, but it's important to understand the Puritans. They were out to purify the Church of England. And we're going to then move on from there in the historical timeline coming up in our next lectures coming up. But before we move on, we need to talk about Reformed Orthodoxy. And this is going to be very important for Puritans and the theology part of the Puritan movement and others. So we need to first talk here about the Synod of Dort. Okay, so the Synod of Dort takes place, and it involves this man named Jacobus Arminius, and we get the word Armenian from it. Jacobus Arminius. Now, he was a Calvinistic professor, and was trained by Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor. So the fruit didn't fall very far from the tree. Beza trained Arminius. Arminius was sent to refute the anti-Calvinistic Dirk Kornhart. Now what happens is, while studying and preparing to confront Kornhart, Arminius came to the conclusion that Kornhart was right, and Arminius rejected Calvinistic belief on predestination. Now, we got to be careful here because we have a lot of, in today's terminology and throwing around Calvinism today, we talk about the Arminian position in complete opposite of Calvinistic beliefs. But back then, Arminius believed in Calvinism except the predestination. He remained Calvinistic in his other beliefs. So soon after, he clashes with a fellow professor, Francis Gomarus. Now, Arminius said this about predestination: God has foreknowledge of who will come to have faith and accept Christ. With this divine foreknowledge, God knew the person's response. Okay, so basically they would be then predestined. And what that kind of an idea is that God is like looking forward in time and seeing who would call on Jesus to be saved, so that with this foreknowledge, then they're predestined. That was Arminius' position on predestination. But Gomarus was complete opposite. He said God, in his sovereign will, decreed who would have faith and call on Jesus to be saved, and they were predestined. So this was the two positions that we see on predestination. Well, the Synod of Dort, which was 1618 to 1619, delegates from Great Britain, Switzerland, and Germany, they come together, and their purpose was to condemn Arminius, which they did. And this is where, out of the Synod of Dort, come the 5 doctrines of Reformed Orthodoxy, which were established, which is the Calvinistic TULIP, TULIP, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And then also out of the second thing that takes place for Reformed Orthodoxy after the Synod of Dort was the Westminster Confession. And this was a much more detailed establishment of Calvinistic doctrines that were established at Dort. So it really goes into more detail, the Westminster Confessions. So that's going to be it for Reformed Orthodoxy, for our lecture on Puritanism and not rationalism. I'm going to cross that out, scribble that out. Okay, I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's it for today. Next time, we are going to be looking at the topic of rationalism. Have a great day.